You can't move these trucks. This is a residential street, not a logging camp. I am the president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association, and you are in violation of Covenants 7, 12, and 19. The voice was a grating symphony of entitlement, a sound that could strip paint from a barn door at 20 paces. It belonged to a woman of ample proportions, wedged into a polo shirt 2 sizes too small. The vaguely fascistic logo of the HOA stretched taut over her chest, like a campaign banner. She stood, arms akimbo, in the middle of the only access road leading from my 400 acres of timberland to the state highway. Behind her, 2 fully loaded logging trucks, each carrying 40 tons of prime pine, idled with the deep, impatient rumble of restrained horsepower. I looked from her puce-colored face, contorted with a mask of self-importance, to the drivers, 2 stoic men who had seen it all and were now looking at me for guidance. This woman, this Karen Fletcher, was the first hostile I had encountered on this ground in the 60 years I had walked it. My ground, not hers. "Ma'am," I said, my voice deliberately low and calm, a counterpoint to her screeching. "This is the Harding Timberlands Access Easement. It was recorded with the county in 1952. Your development was built in 2008. This easement predates your entire existence. Please move." Easement. This road belongs to the HOA. We pay for its upkeep. You are creating a nuisance, damaging our property, and conducting commercial business in a residential zone. I have already called the sheriff, and I am issuing you a $500 fine for each truck. That's $1,000. She had a clipboard. Of course she had a clipboard. It was the scepter of the petty tyrant, the symbol of imagined authority. She brandished it at me as if it were a weapon. In her small, manicured world, it probably was. I took a slow breath, the familiar scent of pine and diesel filling my lungs. It was the smell of my family's livelihood for 3 generations. This land was not just property. It was a living trust, a legacy of sweat and stewardship. My great-grandfather had bought it. My grandfather had defended it from a fire that nearly took everything. My father had replanted it after the pine beetle blight of the 70s. And I, after a 30-year career in the Army Corps of Engineers, had come home to it, seeking the one thing the world could not offer: peace. Peace was now being blockaded by a plus-sized woman in knockoff athletic shoes. My decision was made in that instant, not in a flash of anger, but in a slow, dangerous calm that settled over me like a winter frost. This was not a negotiation. This was a campaign, and she had just fired the first shot. I gave my lead driver, a man named Hank, a simple, almost imperceptible nod. He understood. The engines would stay running. We would not retreat. "Ma'am," I said again, my tone unchanged. "You are illegally obstructing a commercial right-of-way. Every minute these trucks sit here costs me money. I will be adding that to the damages. Now, for the last time, please step aside." "Never. This is my community. I will protect it from people like you. People like me. People who owned the land her cookie-cutter subdivision was carved out of. People who had been here before her manicured lawns and identical mailboxes had ever been a developer's fever dream." The distant wail of a siren began to drift through the trees. "Good. Let the authorities come. Let the first contact report be filed. Every campaign needs a clear, documented, inciting incident." Karen Fletcher, in her profound ignorance, was providing me with a textbook one. The story of this conflict didn't truly begin with the trucks, of course. It began the day I retired. I came home to the old farmhouse, a structure built from the very timber it was surrounded by. its foundations sunk deep into the same red clay. For the first year, it was bliss. I managed the timber, oversaw the selective harvests, and spent my days walking the fire breaks my father had cut. The only sounds were the wind in the pines, the cry of a hawk, and the distant hum of the highway. Then, they built the estates at Whispering Pines. They clear-cut 200 acres of what used to be the old Miller farm, adjacent to my eastern border. They graded it flat, laid down a network of asphalt cul-de-sacs, and erected 100 identical houses with beige vinyl siding. They put up a ridiculous brick and stucco gateway with the name of the subdivision in a swirling gold script. And at the heart of it all, they formed a homeowners association. I paid it no mind. My property was separate, deeded, and sacrosanct. The access road the loggers used was a 50-foot wide strip of land I owned outright, a corridor that cut through a corner of what was now their development. The easement was ironclad, a legal fact as solid as the granite bedrock beneath our feet. I had checked the deeds and the county plat maps myself before the first tree of this year's harvest was even marked. It was a formality, a habit ingrained from decades of logistical planning. Check your lines of supply and communication before the operation begins. The first sign of trouble was a letter. It arrived in my mailbox a month before the harvest. The envelope was made of a heavy, cream-colored cardstock that felt offensively self-important. In the top left corner was the embossed logo of the Whispering Pines HOA, a stylized pine tree trapped inside a perfect circle, a design that felt vaguely fascistic. The letter informed me that a concerned resident had noted my property was in a state of natural overgrowth and that this unmanaged wilderness posed a fire hazard to the community. It politely suggested I clear a 100-foot defensible space along our shared property line. It was signed, with a flourish, by Karen Fletcher, President. I read it, chuckled, and filed it away in a folder I labeled, with a bit of dry amusement, Neighborly Relations. The letter was nonsense. My property was a managed forest, not an unkempt lot. My fire breaks were maintained to state forestry standards, wider and better kept than anything their token landscaping company could manage. Her defensible space was a bureaucratic fantasy. The second letter came a week later. This one was less polite. It referenced a non-existent community standard regarding noise and informed me that the use of chainsaws, skidders, and other heavy machinery would be restricted to the hours of 10 in the morning to 4 in the afternoon on weekdays only. It cited a clause in their HOA covenants, which of course did not apply to me or my land in any way. This one didn't amuse me. It was an attempt to assert authority where none existed. It was a probe, a patrol testing my perimeter for weakness. I did not respond. In my experience, engaging with petty tyrants only emboldens them. You don't argue with them. You document their actions, build a case, and then you dismantle their power structure piece by piece. The confrontation at the road was the escalation I had been expecting. After the sheriff's deputy arrived, a young man with a weary expression who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, the situation was quickly clarified. I presented my copy of the county-filed easement. He glanced at it, then at Karen, who was sputtering about covenants and property values. "Ma'am," the deputy said, with the tired patience of a man who had refereed 1,000 such disputes. "This is a legal easement. It's a civil matter. You can't block this road. If you don't move, you'll be the one I have to cite for obstruction." Her face went through a remarkable series of color changes, from crimson to a blotchy purple. Defeated, but not chastened, she finally stepped aside, stabbing a fat finger in my direction. "This isn't over. You will be hearing from our lawyers. You will be buried in fines." I just nodded as the trucks finally roared to life, their air brakes hissing as they began to roll. That night, I went into my study. The neighborly relations folder was no longer adequate. This was no longer a matter of simple correspondence. This was an operation. I retrieved a heavy 3-inch D-ring binder from the closet, the kind I used to use for briefing books. On the spine, I affixed a label. In neat block letters, I wrote, "Operation Timber Freedom." The first documents to go into the binder were the 2 letters from Karen, each slipped into its own clear plastic sleeve. Then came my copy of the original 1952 deed and the county plat map, highlighting the easement. I wrote a detailed, time-stamped account of the blockade incident, including the deputy's name and badge number. I even added the business cards of the 2 drivers as potential witnesses. My rage from that morning had cooled, settling into a solid core of purpose. This woman had declared war on my peace and my property. She had made the colossal mistake of assuming I was just some old man who could be bullied by a clipboard and a shrill voice. She had no idea who she was dealing with. She had no concept of methodical, relentless, and overwhelming response. She was about to get an education. The next phase of any campaign is reconnaissance. You must know the enemy's terrain, their strengths, and most importantly, their weaknesses. My first step was to acquire a copy of the enemy's field manual, the Whispering Pines HOA covenants, conditions, and restrictions. A quick search of the county's public records website yielded the full document, a 120-page monument to bureaucratic overreach. I spent the next 2 evenings reading it. I didn't just read it, I dissected it. I highlighted passages, made notes in the margins, and cross-referenced sections. It was a masterpiece of poorly written, often contradictory, and legally dubious regulations. It governed everything from the approved shade of beige for a front door to the maximum permissible height of a garden gnome. It was a charter for a tyrant, giving the HOA board, and by extension its president, sweeping powers over the residents. But within its dense, legalistic prose, I found weaknesses. I found procedural requirements for levying fines that were convoluted and easily challenged. I found rules for board meetings that specified notification periods and quorum requirements. And most critically, I found the limits of their jurisdiction. The document, for all its bluster, explicitly stated its authority was confined to the plotted lots within the estates at Whispering Pines. My land was not mentioned. It could not be. It was a legal island, entirely outside their kingdom. My next step was to go higher up the chain of command. The deputy had called it a civil matter, but Karen's attempt to enforce her rules on my property felt like more than that. It felt like impersonating an official, a fraudulent claim of authority. I started with the County Code Enforcement Office. I got a bored-sounding clerk on the phone, a woman who had clearly heard every conceivable complaint a person could have about their neighbor. I calmly and methodically laid out the facts. My property, the pre-existing easement, the new development, and the HOA president's attempts to restrict my access and levy fines against me. "So she's blocking your road?" the clerk asked, her tone shifting slightly from boredom to professional interest. She did. A sheriff's deputy made her move, but her official letters claim my property is subject to her HOA rules. "Is your property part of the Whispering Pines plat?" "No, ma'am, it is not. It is a separate parcel, Harding Timberlands, established decades ago." I could hear the clicking of a keyboard on her end. "Harding, got it. Yeah, I see you here. 412 acres, and I see the easement, filed 1952, updated 1989. It's an easement in gross for ingress, egress, and utilities. Looks ironclad to me. She has no jurisdiction over your land, sir. None. That's what I thought, I said. What can you do about it? Well, if she's sending you official-looking notices and fines based on her HOA authority where she has none, that could be considered a form of harassment, possibly even fraud. I'm going to open a case file. What's her name? Karen Fletcher. Got it. Case number is 22-743. We'll send her a formal letter of inquiry. Usually that's enough to make them back off. These HOA presidents get a little taste of power and think they're the Queen of England. I thanked her and hung up. I carefully noted the case number, the clerk's name, and the date in my binder. This was a significant development. I now had a government agency on my side. I had a case number. This was no longer just my word against hers. It was a matter of official record. The ground had shifted. With the legal and bureaucratic front secured, it was time to build a resistance movement. A tyrant's power is predicated on the belief that their victims are isolated. My next mission was to show the residents of Whispering Pines that they were not alone. The following Saturday, I took a slow walk through the subdivision. It was a depressingly uniform landscape. Every lawn was a perfect green carpet. Every driveway was spotless. Every house a slightly different shade of tan. It felt sterile, controlled. I was dressed in work pants and a simple flannel shirt, looking for all the world like a man out for a stroll. It didn't take long to find my first potential insurgent. An elderly woman was standing by her mailbox, looking forlornly at a small, brightly painted ceramic gnome that lay on its side in her flower bed. A crisp, cream-colored envelope was clutched in her hand. "Good morning," I said, stopping at a polite distance. She looked up, startled. "Oh, hello." "Everything all right?" I asked, nodding toward the fallen gnome. Her face crumpled slightly. "It's the association. They say he's a violation. Unapproved yard ornamentation. I have to pay a $50 fine and remove him by Monday, or it doubles." She looked at the gnome. "My granddaughter gave him to me. She painted it herself." "My name is John Harding," I said. "I own the timberland next door." Her eyes widened. "Oh, you're the one she was shouting about. At the gate." "That's me." I smiled faintly. "It seems our President Fletcher is a busy woman. My violations are costing me $1,000, apparently." A spark of something, defiance perhaps, flickered in the woman's eyes. "It's not right. She bullies everyone. My husband, before he passed, he called her the beige dictator." "I'm Mrs. Gable, by the way," she said, extending a frail hand. "Eleanor Gable." "A pleasure, Eleanor. Tell me, has she done this to other people?" "Oh, heavens, yes. The Martinezes in the blue-doored house, they got a $100 fine because their son's basketball hoop was visible from the street. The Millers got a warning for having the wrong color patio umbrella. She walks around with her clipboard every single day, just looking for things." I listened patiently, absorbing the intelligence. This was exactly what I needed. A pattern of abuse, a litany of petty cruelties that, when taken together, would paint a clear picture of a leader drunk on power. "Eleanor," I said, my voice dropping slightly, "would you be willing to write down what happened with your gnome? Just the facts. Date, time, what the letter said. And would you be willing to talk about it if it came to that?" She hesitated for a moment, looking toward the identical houses, as if Karen herself might materialize from behind a perfectly trimmed boxwood hedge. Then she straightened her shoulders. Yes, yes, I would. It's gone on long enough. I spoke to the Martinezes next, a young couple, exhausted and angry. Their son, a boy of about 10, was listlessly tossing a ball in the garage. His portable basketball hoop was folded up and hidden from view. They told me the same story. The fine, the threat of more fines, the feeling of being watched and judged. I gave them the same advice. Document everything, save the notices, be prepared to speak up. I was planting seeds of dissent that, with the right catalyst, could grow into a full-blown rebellion. By the time I returned home, I had the names of 5 families, each with a story of harassment and petty fines. I added their stories, summarized and anonymized for now, to a new section in my binder labeled Collateral Damage. The official fine notice for the truck incident arrived 2 days later. It was even more grandiose than the letters. Thick, embossed paper, citing the same non-applicable covenants, and demanding payment of $1,000 within 15 days. It also contained a new threat. Any further use of the easement for commercial purposes would result in a lien being placed on my property. A lien. The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of it was almost impressive. She was trying to seize my land as a penalty for a crime I had not committed, under an authority she did not possess. This was no longer just harassment. This was an existential threat. It was time to bring in professional reinforcements. I had maintained a network of contacts from my time in the service. Men and women of exceptional skill and integrity. I made a call to a former colleague at the Pentagon, who made a call to another, and within an hour, I had a name. David Chen, Esquire. Retired Army Major, formerly of the Judge Advocate General's Corps. Now in private practice in the state capital, specializing in real estate and contract law. The file on him said he was sharp, aggressive, and had a particular dislike for bullies. Perfect. I scheduled a meeting for the following afternoon. I drove the 2 hours to his office, the heavy Operation Timber Freedom binder sitting on the passenger seat beside me like a co-pilot. Chen's office was neat, orderly, and unpretentious. He was a man of about 50, fit and trim, with a mind that was clearly just as sharp. He greeted me with a firm handshake and a nod of respect when I introduced myself by my former rank. "Colonel," he said, gesturing to a chair. "Good to meet you. My old CO always said you could tell a Corps of Engineers officer by the fact that their PowerPoint slides were actually legible. What's the situation?" I didn't waste his time with a long, rambling story. I simply placed the binder on his desk and opened it to the first page. "I'm being harassed by an HOA president who believes she has jurisdiction over my private, non-affiliated property." For the next 30 minutes, I walked him through the campaign. I presented the evidence in chronological order. The initial letters, the deed and easement, my detailed report of the blockade, the official fine notice, the county case number, and my intelligence reports on her abuse of the other homeowners. He listened intently, his eyes scanning each document. He occasionally nodded, a small smirk playing on his lips. When I was finished, he leaned back in his chair and looked at the binder, then at me. "Colonel," he said slowly, "this is not a binder. This is a kill box. You've established the field of fire, identified the target, and documented every move she's made. This is the most complete piece of opposition research I've ever seen from a civilian." "I'm not a civilian, Major. I'm retired," I said. "There's a difference." He laughed, a genuine, appreciative sound. "That there is. Well, your target has made a series of critical tactical errors. Asserting authority she doesn't have is bad. Levying fines based on it is worse. Threatening a fraudulent lien? That's a potential felony. She's not just out of bounds. She's on a completely different planet. The feeling that washed over me was one of profound validation. It was the feeling of a plan coming together, of having a superior officer confirm your assessment of the battlefield. I felt 10 feet tall. "So what's our counter-salvo?" I asked. "We start with a letter," Chen said, his eyes gleaming. "But not just any letter. We're going to draft a multi-page, footnoted, exhibit-referenced masterpiece of legal intimidation. It will cite the state statutes she's violating. It will reference the county code enforcement case number. It will detail her potential personal liability for damages, legal fees, and punitive actions. It will demand the immediate rescission of all fines and a formal written apology. And it will put her and her entire board on notice that any further contact of any kind will be met with immediate and overwhelming legal action." He paused, steepling his fingers. "We're not just going to tell her to cease and desist. We're going to educate her on the precise dimensions of the legal wood chipper she's about to walk into." The letter he drafted was a work of art. It was printed on his firm's heavy bond paper, and it ran to 5 pages, plus another 10 pages of exhibits, copies of the deeds, maps, and her own violation notices. It was polite, professional, and utterly terrifying. We sent it via certified mail, return receipt requested, to Karen Fletcher, in her capacity as president, and to each of the other 4 board members individually. Now, we waited. The strategy was to give her the opportunity to retreat and surrender. A sane opponent would have taken it. A sane opponent would have read that letter, consulted a lawyer, and immediately begun backpedaling. But Karen Fletcher was not a sane opponent. She was a petty tyrant, and tyrants cannot abide being told what to do. To her, our letter was not a warning. It was a challenge. Her ego was so vast it had its own gravitational pull, and it was about to pull her and her entire HOA into a black hole. Her response came not in the form of a letter from a lawyer, but in a notice slipped under the windshield wipers of every car in Whispering Pines. It announced an emergency community hearing to be held at the neighborhood clubhouse in 1 week's time. The agenda was singular: to discuss the ongoing violations and hostile actions of the adjacent property owner, John Harding, and to vote on a special assessment for legal fees and the installation of a permanent security gate. She wasn't retreating. She was doubling down. She was trying to use public shaming and the fear of a financial assessment to rally the homeowners to her cause. She was turning the conflict into a public spectacle, hoping to isolate me and paint me as the villain. It was a foolish, desperate move. She thought she was setting a trap for me. In reality, she was marching her entire army into the kill box I had prepared with David Chen. The day before the hearing, however, she made her final, fatal blunder. I was in my workshop when I heard the sound of a heavy truck coming down my access road. Not a logging truck, something smaller. I walked out to the edge of the woods and saw a commercial flatbed from a local company, Reliable Fencing, parked right where the easement met the first of the Whispering Pines cul-de-sacs. 2 men were unloading concrete mix, steel posts, and rolls of chain-link fence. And standing there directing them, clipboard in hand, was Karen Fletcher. She was trying to physically wall me in. Before the hearing, before any vote, she was using HOA funds to unilaterally erect a fence and a gate across my legal right-of-way. I didn't shout. I didn't run over there. I simply went back to my workshop, retrieved my phone, and started recording video. I walked calmly down the drive. The phone held steady. Good morning, Karen, I said, my voice even. She spun around, a triumphant smirk on her face. Harding, I'm glad you're here to see this. The community has had enough. We are securing our property line. This is not your property line, Karen, I said, panning the camera to show the survey marker I had flagged the week before. A steel pin sunk into the ground that clearly marked the edge of my 50-foot easement. This is my access road. You are illegally obstructing it. I have a copy of the county plat map right here. I pulled the folded map from my pocket. That means nothing, she screeched. The board has approved this. This is for the safety of our children. I turned my attention to the two fence installers, who had stopped working and were now watching the exchange with growing unease. Gentlemen, I said, making sure the phone was recording their faces and the logo on their truck. I need your names. You are currently participating in a criminal act. This is a legally recorded easement. By building this fence, you are trespassing and destroying private property. I am informing you now that you and your company will be named as co-defendants in the lawsuit I will be filing in approximately 1 hour. I let that sink in. I saw the calculation in their eyes. They were hourly workers, caught in the middle of something they suddenly realized was far above their pay grade. He's lying, Karen shrieked. You work for the HOA. You answer to me. The older of the two workers, a man with a weathered face, looked at me, then at Karen, then at the survey marker. He made a decision. Ma'am, he said to Karen, his voice thick with a country accent. We can't do this. If that's his land, we're trespassing. Our insurance won't cover it. We're going to have to call the boss. You'll do as I say. No, ma'am, he said, shaking his head. We're done here. He and his partner began loading their equipment back onto the truck. Karen stood there, her mouth opening and closing like a beached fish, her face a mask of incandescent fury. She had been publicly disobeyed. Her authority had evaporated before her very eyes. I kept the phone recording the entire beautiful retreat. The truck backing out, the workers refusing to even look at her, and her standing alone amidst a few bags of unused concrete. It was a perfect, self-contained vignette of hubris and failure. I saved the video file and immediately emailed a copy to David Chen with the subject line, Exhibit G. That evening, as I was finalizing my notes for the hearing, my phone rang. It was an unknown number. Is this Mr. Harding? A nervous, reedy voice asked. It is. Mr. Harding, my name is Arthur Finch. I'm the treasurer of the Whispering Pines HOA. My posture straightened. This was unexpected, an inside source. What can I do for you, Mr. Finch? Look, this has gone too far, he stammered. This fence thing today, Karen just did it. She didn't get a board vote. She just used the reserve funds. She told me to cut a check to a company called Fletcher Landscaping and Security for $10,000 for the gate installation. A cold certainty settled in my gut. Fletcher Landscaping? Any relation? It's her brother's company, Finch whispered. And I don't think it's even a real company. I think it's just a post office box. She's done this before. Beautification projects, consulting fees. It's always a check to some company owned by a relative. I didn't want to say anything. I was afraid of her. But this lawsuit stuff. I have a family. I can't be held liable for fraud. Mr. Finch, I said calmly. Do you have records of these payments? Yes. Bank statements. Invoices. I have the password to the HOA's accounting software. Can you get them to me? There was a long pause. Yes, he finally said. his voice firming with resolve. I'll email them to a private account. She can't be allowed to get away with this. She's going to ruin all of us. An hour later, my inbox chimed. The email from a generic, anonymous account contained a password-protected zip file. Arthur Finch had sent me everything. 3 years of bank statements, invoices, and board meeting minutes. The smoking gun, the kill shot. I spent the next 4 hours cross-referencing the documents. It was worse than I thought. A clear, undeniable pattern of embezzlement and self-dealing. Over $70,000 had been funneled through the HOA's accounts into shell companies owned by Karen's brother and cousin for services that were either never rendered or were grossly overbilled. The landscaping, the pool maintenance, the legal consulting. It was a family grift, funded by the mandatory dues of her neighbors. I printed out the most damning evidence: the invoice from Fletcher Landscaping for the non-existent gate, the corresponding bank transfer, and the state business filing for the company, listing her brother as the sole proprietor. I slipped these final pages into the binder. Operation Timber Freedom was now complete. All objectives had been achieved. All assets were in place. All that was left was the final confrontation. The clubhouse was packed. Nearly every homeowner was there, drawn by the promise of drama and the threat of a special assessment. The air was thick with tension and the smell of stale coffee. Karen and her 2 sycophantic board members, a mousy woman and a belligerent-looking man, sat at a folding table at the front, looking solemn and important. They were the tribunal. I took a seat in the front row, my binder resting on my lap. David Chen sat beside me, looking calm and composed in a sharp suit. Mrs. Gable gave me a nervous but determined nod from across the aisle. The Martinezes were a few rows back, their faces grim. My insurgency was in place. Karen banged a small, toy-like gavel on the table. This emergency hearing of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association is now in session. She launched into her opening salvo, her voice ringing with practiced indignation. She painted a picture of a peaceful, idyllic community under siege by a hostile corporate logging operation. She spoke of safety concerns, property values, and flagrant disregard for our community standards. She portrayed me as an arrogant outsider, a bully who refused to play by the rules. "This man," she declared, pointing a trembling finger at me, "has refused all our good faith efforts to find a compromise. He has responded with threats and intimidation. He has even hired a high-priced lawyer to sue us, to sue you. To protect our community, our way of life, the board proposes 2 measures. First, a special assessment of $200 per household to fund our legal defense and the immediate construction of a permanent security gate at the entrance to our neighborhood. Second, a vote to authorize the board to place a lien on the Harding property for his thousands of dollars in unpaid fines." A murmur went through the crowd. The $200 assessment got their attention. This was now costing them real money. "I now open the floor for discussion," she said, a smug look on her face. She expected a chorus of agreement. "I have a question," I said, rising slowly to my feet. My voice was calm and carried easily through the room. Karen's eyes narrowed. "You are not a member of this association. You have no standing to speak." "Actually," David Chen said, standing beside me, his voice smooth and authoritative, "Mr. Harding has been made the subject of this hearing and the target of a proposed financial action. He absolutely has the right to be heard. I'd also remind the board that I am his legal counsel, and this is an official proceeding. Everything said here tonight is on the record." The word council sent a small tremor of fear through the two other board members. Karen, however, was unmoved. Fine. What is your question? It's a simple one, President Fletcher, I said, opening my binder. Before the homeowners vote to spend their money on a gate, they should know that you already spent $10,000 of their money yesterday trying to build one illegally. Is that correct? The room went silent. Karen's face paled. That was an emergency measure. For security. An emergency measure that you paid for with a check from the HOA reserve account, made out to a company called Fletcher Landscaping and Security, which is owned by your brother, Daniel Fletcher. Is that also correct? I didn't need a projector. My voice was enough. The accusation hung in the air, deadly and precise. Gasps rippled through the audience. That's a lie! That's slander! She sputtered. Is it? I held up the printed invoice. Here is the invoice, and here is the bank statement showing the transfer, and here is the state business filing. Would any of the homeowners like to see them? Before anyone could answer, a reedy voice piped up from the back. It's true. I'm Arthur Finch, the treasurer. She made me cut the check. There was no board approval. The room erupted. The tide had not just turned. It was a tsunami. Karen was staring at Finch with a look of pure hatred. Her sycophants looked like they wanted the floor to swallow them whole. And that's not all, I continued, my voice cutting through the noise. President Fletcher has told you that I am a threat. The truth is, she has been the threat. She has been running this community not as a public servant, but as her own personal fiefdom, harassing residents and levying illegal fines for years. I paused and looked at Eleanor Gable. It was her cue. She stood up, her hands trembling slightly but her voice clear. She fined me $50 for a garden gnome my granddaughter gave me, she said to the crowd. She told me I was ruining the neighborhood's aesthetic. Then Mr. Martinez stood. She fined us $100 because our son's basketball hoop was visible from the street. She threatened to double it every week. We had to take it away from him. One by one, the people I had spoken to stood up. A woman who was fined for having the wrong color welcome mat. A man who was cited because his trash can was put out 2 hours too early. The stories poured out, a flood of pent-up resentment and fear, washing over the board members at the front. The picture they painted was undeniable. This isn't about a gate or logging trucks, I said, my voice resonating in the now silent room. This is about an abuse of power. This is about your money being used not to improve your community, but to fund a personal vendetta and enrich a board member's family. David Chen stepped forward. For the record, he stated, any attempt to place a lien on Mr. Harding's property will be met with a suit for fraudulent lien, a felony in this state. Any further attempt to block his legal easement will result in immediate court action seeking damages. The County Code Enforcement Office already has an active investigation into President Fletcher's actions. And based on the documents I have seen tonight, the District Attorney's Office will likely be very interested in the HOA's financial records. The final nail. The mention of the District Attorney caused Arthur Finch to visibly flinch and the other two board members to look at each other in sheer panic. I looked out at the faces of the homeowners. They were no longer confused or scared. They were furious. They finally understood. I make a motion, I said, though I had no official standing to do so, that this community hold a vote of no confidence in President Fletcher and the entire current board, and that they be removed from their positions, effective immediately. Mr. Martinez's voice boomed from the back. I'm a member. I second that motion. Karen was screaming now, banging her useless little gavel. "You can't do that. It's against the bylaws. This is an illegal meeting." But no one was listening to her anymore. Her power was gone. It had been an illusion, and I had shattered it. "All in favor of the motion to remove the board?" Mr. Martinez shouted. A deafening roar of "Aye" filled the room. It was nearly unanimous. "All opposed?" Silence. Only Karen Fletcher stood, her mouth agape, her face a blotchy canvas of disbelief and rage. Then, with a strangled sob, she grabbed her purse and her clipboard and fled the room, pushing her way through the crowd of her former subjects. Her reign was over. The aftermath was swift and decisive. An interim board was elected on the spot, with Mr. Martinez as the new president. Their first official act was to unanimously void every fine Karen had ever issued. Their second was to pass a resolution formally apologizing to me and acknowledging my easement rights in perpetuity. Arthur Finch, granted immunity in exchange for his testimony, handed over all the financial records to David Chen, who forwarded them to the district attorney. Karen Fletcher and her brother were indicted 2 months later on multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement. She was forced to sell her home to pay for her legal fees and make restitution to the HOA. She left the neighborhood in disgrace. Her little empire crumbled to dust. The atmosphere in Whispering Pines changed overnight. The fear was replaced by a sense of liberation. People put their basketball hoops back up. Eleanor Gable's garden gnome was returned to his place of honor, soon joined by a dozen others in a show of solidarity. The beige conformity began to crack, replaced by the small, welcome signs of individuality. A month after the hearing, the new HOA board, led by Martinez, organized a neighborhood barbecue. They asked if they could hold it on my property, in the meadow by the spring that fed into the creek. I agreed. I watched as the families of Whispering Pines, people who had once been strangers living in identical boxes, mingled on my land. Their kids ran through the grass, chasing fireflies as the sun went down. Martinez came over and handed me a beer. "We can never thank you enough, John," he said. "Like you did it yourselves," I told him. "You just needed to realize you weren't alone." He nodded, looking out at the community he was now tasked with leading. "No more beige dictator," he said with a grin. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home, I sat on my porch, the scent of wood smoke and grilled food still lingering in the air. The binder, Operation Timber Freedom, sat on the table next to me. Its mission was complete. I picked it up, walked back to my study, and placed it in a storage box in the back of a deep closet. A relic of a war that should never have been fought, but one that had to be won. The peace I had come home for had been threatened, but in fighting for it, I had helped an entire community find their own. The wind whispered through the pines, a sound as old as the land itself. It was the sound of my peace, hard-won and absolute. I was home. The campaign was over.